All right. I say let's jump into the first slide if everyone's on board with that. So the first two questions, what is Islam and why should we care? So if you didn't know, Islam is the world's second largest religion and it's growing extremely rapidly. By 2050, it will nearly eclipse Christianity, and by 2070, according to Pew Research, it should overtake the world as the number one worldview. So at least we should be able to understand what they believe and essentially equip ourselves against it if it's not true. Very similar to Christians. So Christians want to spread the gospel to all nations, Matthew 28, but Islam has a very similar Great Commission, essentially. They want to make the entire world Muslim. So they want to disseminate Islam and convert every single person to be Muslim. That is their main goal, is to make the world Muslim. And as you see, this religion is no longer confined just to the Middle East. It's rapidly growing and has infiltrated many Western nations: New Zealand, Ireland, the United Kingdom, Netherlands, Canada, the United States, and places like Dearborn, Michigan, Minnesota, Texas, and New York City, as well as just New York State in general. But then this begs a very interesting question about stereotypes and whether or not we should classify Islam under one umbrella heading, or should we differentiate between Muslims that do atrocities on 9/11 to regular Muslims, right? So when you think of Muslims, maybe 9/11 comes to mind, which is when a plane crashed into the World Trade Center buildings, right, on 9/11, and it was a huge terrorist attack, the worst terrorist attack that has ever happened in the United States. Should we use those people to classify as standard Muslims? Or are those people heretical and heretics according to Islam? And should they be like stiff-armed out of the religion? Like, are they not properly representing Allah and his words? I don't want to judge a worldview by its abuses, but rather its prescriptions. You don't judge a worldview based on its greatest heretic, but its greatest prophet. And you shouldn't judge a worldview based on its seeds, but by its fruits. So, should these people characterize Islam? Well, we can find out, but first we'll look at some history. So on this slide, is there any general questions about this slide regarding their growth rate, what happened on 9/11, and whether or not 9/11 accurately characterizes Islam?
So if Islam is spreading so quickly, what's the selling point? Why are so many people, if it's one that is based, as far as we can tell so far, on more or less violence and authoritarianism, why are so many people converting?
Well, it's interesting that not a lot of people are necessarily converting. You have about almost an equal number of people going out of Islam as coming into Islam. But the reason the growth rates are happening is because people are having children. Muslim families are having children, and those children are being indoctrinated into Islam, and that's how it's spreading. But I understand your point. Now you're saying, what's the appeal to Islam? Well, number one, they would say because it's true. If Islam is true, then people should obey the truth, right? Second reason is that if you're specifically a male, you get to almost do whatever you want, right? It gives you very, very a loose moral chain attached to you, especially if it's in the name of Allah or to spread Islam. So it's very appealing to almost like primal instincts in people to, it's like, oh, I can do this thing. I can lie if I'm furthering Islam, right? There's a doctrine called taqiyya, right? It means that you can use deceit as long as it's to further Islam, right? So that's very appealing to people. It's like, oh, I can lie and I can do these things as long as it's appealing and leading people to Islam. Right, that's interesting. I can take advantage of women, right? If I'm a Muslim, I can have multiple wives, right? So these things are very appealing, specifically to males, right? Then the males would subjugate the females, have children. Islam grows. So those are very appealing things, at least from a patriarchal perspective, to further Islam, and that's why it has grown pretty rapidly. But like I said, a lot of people are also coming out of Islam thanks to the internet. But it's mainly people having children and raising them as Muslims, and then that is now their culture. Some of them never break away from that, and then they have children of their own, loads of children. And that's how it is spreading so rapidly and overtaking multiple countries. It's literally on every continent. All right, so I'm going to move on to the second slide. Let's get into some of the histories, or the history of the Quran, Muhammad, and Allah, and Mecca. So the three things I want you to take away from this slide is the man, the book, and the place. So the man is Muhammad, the book is the Quran, and the place is Mecca. These are all three extremely important to their worldview. So let's start off with Muhammad. Who was Muhammad? Well, Muhammad was born in 570 AD, and he died in 632 AD. He started off as a camel driver until he was about 25, and then he ran a fruit business for 15 years. Then, in 610 AD, he went to a cave and prayed, and supposedly Jibril, or the angel Gabriel, came down and gave him a special revelation. Then, later, this revelation was written down and compiled into what we know as the Quran. And Gabriel's main message to Muhammad was that there is only one God, he is Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger, and all mankind should be subject or essentially like submit to the will of Allah. Their first article of faith and their first pillar both would reflect that. So it'd be the Shahada and their belief in Allah, declaring the testimony, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. And then also in here, I say that Muslim literally means to submit or submission, and Allah is just the Arabic word for God. So obviously their Allah is not our Allah, unless you ask a Muslim. Then they will say our Allah is their Allah, which is just the word God. So that's Muhammad. We talked a little bit about how the Quran was composed. It was a special revelation from Muhammad, which he received originally from the angel Gabriel. Throughout his life, he got more of these revelations, either through dreams, visions, or visitations from an angelic creature. And then these were all composed into the Quran. Now, the interesting thing about the place, Mecca in Saudi Arabia, is Muhammad was a part of a tribe called the Quraysh tribe. The Quraysh tribe ran the Kaaba, which is the black cube we were referring to earlier, which houses the black stone. But not only did it house the black stone, it also housed around 359 other idols. So the black stone was an idol, and the black stone was specifically the idol for Muhammad's tribe. It was the moon god, and the moon god was called Allah. Very interesting. So Allah was just one of 360 total idols, one for each day, because they operate off of a lunar calendar. So 360 days in total for them, one God for every single day. Muhammad tried to spread this revelation to other people in Mecca, and they weren't having it. They were like, no, Allah is not the only idol. He's just your tribe's God. I'm going to keep my God. So they end up running Muhammad out of town, really didn't get many converts, and then he flees to Medina. In Medina, he ends up becoming very powerful. He starts to rob caravans, became exceedingly wealthy. After becoming very wealthy, he gains political power. After gaining political power, he starts waging wars, and he becomes a warlord. He wages around 66 battles, very, very bloody. He was a military genius of his time, and he ends up winning all of them and just increases his army, his politics, and his overall power. He then comes back to Mecca, overtakes the Kaaba, destroys all of the other idols except Allah, the moon idol, right, from the black stone, and it's now the only idol still left in the Kaaba.
Is that why the Muslims symbol is a crescent?
That's exactly right. On the top of mosques and even on some of their flags, you will see the crescent moon. Well, the crescent moon symbol is Allah's symbol because he was originally just the moon god. So that's kind of the story of the man, the book, and the place. Yes.
So that recounting of Muhammad that you gave, if I was like a Sunni Muslim, would I be like, that's accurate, I accept that? Or would I be like, this is an outrage? Because the way you described it was, that paints him in somewhat of a, not necessarily wholly positive.
I would say, if I had to put a number on it, I would say they would agree with about 70% of what I said. They would say that the wars that he engaged in were defensive wars. They would say that, yes, Muhammad had this revelation for monotheism and threw out all of the other false gods. So they would agree with that. They might disagree on things like the Kaaba. They may say that Abraham or Ishmael originally built the Kaaba, and it wasn't just already functioning as a place of trade with all of these other idols in it. They may or may not agree with that. I'm not sure. But overall, they would agree with most of what I just said.
And is his, in terms of like historically, if you're just like, what are the sources for Muhammad, like kind of his early life? Is that a lot of like his own writings, or are there other historians at the time?
So it wouldn't be great question. So it wouldn't be Muhammad's writings because Muhammad was illiterate. So he couldn't read or write according to tradition. However, we have loads of hadith about him, which are traditions about what Muhammad said and did, written by his companions and his followers and even his wives. So we have a lot of testimony from them about who Muhammad was, what he did, what he didn't do, and what he should have done, to say the least. So we have a lot of some of this stuff comes from hadith. Some of this just comes from secular history. So the parts that they wouldn't agree with would come from secular history.
So if he was illiterate, where does the Quran come from?
That's the miracle of the Quran. So people will say, well, because some people will just say, oh, well, Muhammad wrote it. And then the Muslim response is, well, Muhammad couldn't have written the Quran because he's illiterate. So I would just say that I would say we don't know for sure who wrote the Quran, but our best guess is that his wives and his followers wrote what Muhammad revealed to them down, and it was then compiled into the Quran. But to them, the Quran is a miracle. It is literally a miracle.
Would they necessarily agree with that explanation of like his followers basically writing things down, or would they just be like, no?
I think it would depend on the type of Muslim you ask. Others would say it was composed over time by his followers and his wives writing things down, because Muhammad he would recite these revelations to his followers, and his followers would memorize them. Right? There's people that have memorized the entire Quran. Right? 114 chapters is the standardized Quran. So they knew what Muhammad said, and then when he was getting old, and he's like, oh, we should probably start writing this down, So it was most likely composed in that way.
And is Muhammad is he ever claimed to be like perfect, or is that part of the tradition?
So I don't think that Muhammad was ever claimed to be perfect, but they view him as their moral exemplar. Like he is an exemplar for their view. Like if you want to emulate somebody, a good Muslim should emulate Muhammad. He is their example, their best example. However, I would contend with them that according to their Quran, Jesus was sinless. Very, very similar to Christian theology. So I would say, why isn't Jesus the exemplar for Islam? Because we said so ourselves. In the Quran, Jesus is sinless and Muhammad is not. So why is Muhammad the exemplar and not Jesus? So it's an interesting conundrum.
Would they just say it's simply because Allah chose him? Like, Jesus wasn't given the Quran, Muhammad was. So would they just appeal to God's essentially determinate choice of Muhammad and be okay with that? Or
they may say that, but again, even Jesus was given the Injil. So Jesus was given special revelation as well. So in that sense, they kind of equal out. If you really do, I do this in my Worldview 3 video, which compares and contrasts Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. I actually have a comparison chart between the Quranic version of Jesus, or Isa, and Muhammad. And it seems that Jesus has a lot more checks next to his name in regards to moral superiority and overall authority than Muhammad did. But no, according to the Quran and the Quranic narrative, Jesus is second to Muhammad. So I don't know why they give him that over and above Jesus position of authority, but according to the narrative, that is the ongoing Islamic narrative.
I have a question.
question. Are there any accounts written by his followers or wives that he lived a sober life
That he lived a sober life?
from drugs or any?
Oh, quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. The hadiths, I won't go into detail, but no, there aren't very flattering traditions about him, which is one of the reasons why there are other people that would say that Muhammad never existed, or maybe there were a lot of Muhammads. Perhaps there were a lot of Muhammads, but certainly he exists. I think that we have way too many literary sources and embarrassing details about this guy for him not to have existed. He passes the criteria of embarrassment 100-fold. So he's most likely a historical character. Like I'm pretty certain he is a historical character, just based on the hadith that is written about him from his companions, followers, and his wives.
I've heard like one maybe more popular critique of Muhammad was around like him marrying like a very young girl, maybe several, I'm not sure. I'm curious in your studies if you found that to be like, that seemed to be accurate or valid, or just kind of like maybe exaggerated.
Yeah, so Muhammad marrying his wife Aisha, right, is really accurate because we have texts that Aisha wrote. So, yes, and Muslims will defend his marriage to Aisha. So Aisha was 6 years old when she married Muhammad, who was around 50. They then consummated the marriage when she was 9. And Muslims nowadays will defend that, saying that, oh no, like they were mature enough, people matured way faster back then, like it's fine, like this was commanded from Allah. So obviously there are problems there, which I won't go into. So yes, that is a true story from very accurate source, being Aisha herself wrote about it. So yes, those are very very true stories in regards to that. Even though the Quran says you're only allowed to have 4 wives, and Muhammad had a lot, more than 8, let's say.
So, like the Bible scripture, we don't have original manuscripts. Do we have original manuscripts of what they've written, or is it the same similar thing of like copies being made and?
Yes. So you're talking, that's a textual criticism question. So you're right. Yeah. Christians don't have autographed copies of original manuscripts. And I think one of the closest things you get to the Quran is called the Birmingham manuscript. They do have manuscripts. They just don't have as many as, let's say, the New Testament. The New Testament, for any document in antiquity, the New Testament has thousands and thousands and thousands in a multitude of languages. Like in total, if we do codexes to fragments, we would have around 25,800. They would have maybe a few hundred to a few thousand, but nowhere near the amount of texts that we Christians have for the New Testament.
Okay, and what's like their earliest dated manuscript?
Their earliest dated manuscript would probably be the Birmingham Quran. All right, so now let's talk about, is it true? Testing the Quran's claims. So what I like about Islam and Christianity is that they both tell you a test that you can run to determine whether or not their contents are true. In Christianity, it says that, Paul says that essentially if you can disprove the resurrection, then we should all be pitied, right, among all people. If the resurrection fails, the entire worldview collapses. It is the cornerstone. Well, the Quran, which I respect, has a very similar verse. In Surah 4, Ayah 82, Surah just means chapter. Each chapter has a name, but Surah is just the general term for chapter, and Ayah is just verse. So in Surah 4, Ayah 82, it states that if the Quran were not from Allah, that it would contain inconsistencies, contradictions, errors. So if you can find one error or contradiction in the Quran, then you should not trust the Quran. It's one of my favorite verses. So there are things that clearly contradict in the Quran. So, for instance, in chapter 12, verse 111, the Quran is called a detailed explanation of all things, meaning that every single piece of truth ever should be in the Quran. Right? Now, some people could say, oh, well, like, tying my shoe, right, isn't in the Quran, right? Now, I don't really know what a Muslim would do with that, but I think that's not really a fair error, so to speak. So instead, I would just use chapter 3, verse 7, which says that some verses are unclear and only known to Allah. Well, now we have a contradiction. It's either all the verses are clear and are a detailed explanation, or that some verses are unclear. You cannot have a completely clear book and a book with unclear verses. Contradiction 1. Creation timeline. Did Allah create the earth in 6 days or 8 days? According to chapter 10, verse 3, chapter 11, verse 7, chapter 25, verse 59, it says 6 days. But according to chapter 41, 9 through 12, it says 8 days. Seems to be an error. And you can see for yourself all of the other contradictions. This is only a small sliver. There are 20 other slides that have contradictions on them, or at least supposed contradictions, because some of these contradictions, I can't think of a way how it couldn't be a contradiction. For instance, some verses say Noah's family survived the flood. Other verses say Noah's son drowned. So did some of his family survive the flood or not? Right? Did all of his family survive or only some of his family survive? Can Allah have a son? This chapter and verse say no. This chapter and verse say yes. There's also historical inaccuracies. For instance, some Bible stories are borrowed by the Quran, such as the Exodus. In the Exodus story of the Quran, it says that Pharaoh threatened people with crucifixion. Well, crucifixion wasn't invented until hundreds of years later. They had no concept of crucifixion. It wasn't invented yet. This is an anachronism, meaning that at the time this book was written, crucifixion existed, and then they backpedaled that as if it's ancient. It's not. Next, and this is my personal favorite one, Jesus' death. This is both an internal critique and an external critique. What do I mean by that? An internal critique is where you take two Quran verses and they contradict. That's internal. External critique is where you have something in history outside of the Quran that invalidates it. In Surah 4, Ayah 157, it says, "He was neither killed nor crucified, but it was only made to appear so." Speaking of Jesus, meaning Jesus was not killed nor crucified. Jesus of Nazareth was killed by Roman crucifixion under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. This is a fact. I've talked about this ad nauseum in 7 other videos. However, so that's an external critique. I'm saying a historical fact the Quran gets wrong. But let's just say that Allah somehow fooled everybody and he wasn't killed. There's another verse in the Quran. It is Surah 19:33, and it talks about the day Jesus dies and the day Jesus resurrects. That is in direct contradiction because they don't believe in a resurrected Jesus. And they also don't believe that Jesus died. You can't have it both ways. You can't say Jesus never died and he only ascended and it was only made to appear so. And then you can't have a verse that says that he did die and then resurrect. Blatant contradictions. Do we have any questions about the contradictions in the Quran to determine whether or not Islam is true?
Regarding Jesus' death and resurrection, would Muslims take a swoon theory approach? Like, is that kind of the route that they're suggesting in the verse, or is something else?
It will depend. So the verse itself says, we neither killed him nor crucified him. So depending on what Muslim you talk to, they don't even think he was put on the cross. Except there are people who are inconsistent. There's normally about 3 theories. One is that Muslims take. So some Muslims say, you know what? I'm just going to reinterpret this verse and act as he did get crucified, but he survived. And that would be the classic swoon theory. Okay. Others will have a substitution theory, saying Jesus wasn't put on the cross, but maybe somebody took his place. Many of them say Judas took his place. And then the last theory is some of them just bite the bullet. They just say he was crucified and he was killed. So it really depends on what Muslim you talk to and how much they know about these particular topics. But those are the 3 main versions that I have heard and come across with in conversation with Islam. If they didn't say that it is errorless or that it contains no inconsistencies or contradictions, I don't think these would be that bad. Obviously, they would just be errors. But when a book puts its entire authority on its perfection, and you can go in and obviously know it's not perfect, there seems to be a disconnect by its own standard.
Well, I'll add on to that and say I remember we were talking about this and you were saying like the Bible as a whole, nor do any of the books of the Bible, they don't make the claim that the Bible itself is inerrant.
That's true. The Bible itself has no verse that says that it's inerrant. That is true. The Quran does have a verse like that. So if you find an error in a Quran, it's absolutely catastrophic. If you found a error in the Bible, if there are any, it wouldn't matter on any major doctrine.
I mean, kind of stepping outside of the realm of theology and into kind of like society and culture. This might be a little too off topic, but would you say there's almost like an excommunication process if like someone in a Muslim community like believes in an error, that they would be kind of like taken out of the mosque or silenced in a way, or like I guess the level of strictness would kind of depend on each mosque or each community.
Yeah, it would depend on the particular circumstance and the culture around them. As long as the person doesn't become apostate, it should be okay with differing levels of severity. So if somebody says that the Quran does have errors in it, obviously that goes against the Quranic narrative. It'd be a huge problem. But if they still believe in the Quran, I don't think they would be killed for it. But if they renounce the Quran because of this, then they become apostate and then they could be killed, according to Sharia.
Yeah, because I know sometimes with religious scripture, sometimes it's challenging to like wrap our heads around spiritual things. I mean, something that's on the handout that we're going to talk about later, it looks like is like, you know, the Trinity, for example. Like even as a Christian, sometimes it's kind of hard to wrap around what seems like on the surface a logical inconsistency of like three gods in ones. But we've talked about that, and you were talking about how it kind of goes into the nuance of like saying like three gods as one is like saying like they're all like if one's like the ocean and one's a lake, they're all still waters, kind of like
I'll leave the Trinity for when we get to it, but yeah, the Trinity is not three gods. That is not the definition of the Trinity. The Trinity is a monotheistic subcategory where you have monotheism, and then the subcategories would be Unitarianism, Binitarianism, Trinitarianism, and all the rest. So it would be a God that is tripersonal, but it would not be three gods. That would be tritheism, not Trinitarianism. But yeah, we'll talk more about that later. Any other questions on errors in the Quran and how this is extremely problematic for Muslims? When I get into a conversation with Muslims, this is one of the first things that I want to talk about.
I was going to ask, I feel like sometimes, I know you mentioned like biblical inerrancy and kind of there can be differing, you know, the Christianity does not necessarily rest on that. Mm-hmm. But I feel like sometimes some of those issues also can come down to like translational issues as well, in terms of like, are you interpreting the original language that it was first written down in, and how is that translated to other languages? Sometimes things can get lost, right? With the Quran, if I understand right, isn't it read in the original language, right? Like it usually, like these contradictions you're referring to are not from like repeated translation or other things like that, right? Is that true? Yeah,
so the Quran, properly read, is pure Arabic. It's in Arabic, even though there are parts that aren't in Arabic. So, but yes, it's supposed to be read in Arabic. Okay. And these English versions of them, it's not like the errors only come in the English version. These errors are present in the Quran manuscripts themselves. So it's not like something is being lost in translation, which I'm sure things are, because you can only really read the Quran if you're reading it in Arabic, according to the narrative. But yes, these errors are in the original Arabic.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so it can't just be chalked up to...
That's right. It can't be chalked up. Yes. So sometimes they'll say, oh, well, like that's just a different recitation, or that's just an English copy of it. let's go back to the original language, and these are present there as well. Now we're going to talk about, is Islam good? Because maybe it's not true, but at least it's good, right? There's other worldviews like that. Maybe some pacifistic worldviews. They're just live and let live. You know, you believe what you believe, I'll believe what I believe. I'm not violent. I'll help society. I'll give to the poor, right? Those worldviews, if they're not grounded in truth, aren't true, but maybe they're good for society. So this is more of a pragmatic perspective. So is Islam pragmatically good? Is it good? Well, that's where we start to talk about the verses. Islam is the religion of the sword. Historically, Muslims, in their worldview, divide the world into two houses. You are either in the house of Islam or you are in the house of war. Right now, there is no caliphate, there is no house of Islam, which means everything and everyone who is not a Muslim is the house of war. Which leads to various verses, as you see on screen. I won't call out every chapter, every surah, and every ayah, but I will tell you what they say. Fight the unbelievers. Fight Jews and Christians specifically. No peace with infidels. Wage war on infidels. Infidel is anyone who is not a Muslim. Torture unbelievers. Slay unbelievers wherever found. Maim and crucify critics. Behead non-Quran believers. Kill infidels wherever found. Obviously, some of these repeat in other verses. So, chapter 9 of the Quran is the last written, even though in the standardized Quran there's 114 chapters. It is not composed chronologically. The Quran is composed based on how long each chapter is. So chapter 1 would be the longest. Chapter 114 would be the shortest. But chapter 9, chronologically, is the last chapter written, and it is by far the most gruesome, the most bloody, and the worst chapter to read in regards to Islamic violence. So when people say that Islam is a religion of peace, just break open your Quran and go to chapter 9. A few of these are from chapter 9. It is not a religion of peace. The Quran gradually becomes more and more violent because it gets more and more pushback from non-believers, Jews, and Christians. That's what leads to these chapters, and specifically chapter 9, in regards to their harshness and their wars, essentially, the house of war. So all non-Muslims are considered a part of the house of war, and it leads to these chapters. So don't let anyone fool you saying, oh, well, that's only chapter 9. And in chapter, 95, it says, like, live and let live or something, which it doesn't say that. But some of them, there are verses that say there is no compulsion in religion. They'll use that as in, like, oh, like, you can have your religion, I can have my religion. Yeah, but there's other verses that come later, and they say, kill everyone who doesn't believe in the Quran or who criticizes the Quran. So it's either A, we have another contradiction, which would disprove the Quran, or you would take the ones that come later, the ones that are the most recent revelation. And that would be chapter 9, the most bloody and violent chapter. So no, these are not taken out of context either. These are not times during like war and pillaging and self-defense. These are not those times. These are about Muhammad when he's filthy rich at the end of his life. He's done all the damage he wants, and now he gives marching orders to his Muslim brethren to go out, subjugate the world, make it all Muslim, because they're a part of the house of war. They are not a part of the house of Islam. Any questions on the violent verses of Islam? And also, this is only a sliver of them. There's plenty more.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, if those verses were specifically, like, to be, like, referenced in times of war. So, like, maybe you don't really pay attention much to it when you're not in war. Is it, like, I was wondering if that was the case, or I don't know.
There are Muslims that will try to frame it like that. They'll say, oh, these verses are only applicable in times of war, right? But when Muhammad wrote these, they weren't at war. And the context specifically, including on this, your sixth pillar is jihad. It is the holy war. It is the struggle and fight against enemies. Now, some more liberal or progressive Muslims or Western Muslims will say that that just means an internal struggle or a spiritual struggle, which it can be translated like that. But that is not historically how it's been interpreted or what seems to have been meant by Muhammad. I don't know how you metaphorically torture unbelievers. I don't know how you somehow analogize the maiming and crucifying of critics. Seems a tough pill to swallow. That leads us to Sharia. What happens when Islam is the majority, or if they become the majority, and everyone is the House of Islam, and they get to implement Sharia law? Sharia just means a path, specifically a path to water, and it's the body of Islamic law that is derived from the books such as the Quran and the Hadith. Some people will say, well, no one really knows what Sharia is because there's so many different interpretations of Sharia. The problem with that is the vast majority of interpretations of Sharia are all extremely violent, very bloody, and are not good culturally for society. Sharia involves things such as killing apostates, the persecution of LGBTQ people, including throwing them off buildings and then stoning them if they're not dead. They command religious genocide specifically against Jews and Christians. And they are terrible for women and women's rights. I won't go through the verses that tell you what you can do to any of these subgroups of people, but they are not pretty. So I write that the strict practices of Sharia are incompatible with modern human rights and dignity, and really any Western values in general. So this is Sharia. And this is only a small portion of Sharia. There are plenty of other laws that I didn't put on this particular slide. So some people will say, oh, well, that's not real Sharia, right? And then they'll have to try to reinterpret all of the verses that would support these. But if you really just read the Quran in its context and the Hadith, this is exactly what was practiced during the caliphates. These are Muhammad's closest advisors and companions that inherited these laws. And this is what was implemented. It hasn't changed because it can't change. Is there any question on Sharia law and what Sharia means, what it means once they take over? For instance, a Muslim will not come over when they're the minority and implement Sharia because it won't work. They have to wait for them to become a majority or become powerful. So while they're the minority, they'll practice things like taqiyya, which is allowing them to lie and to deceive, as long as they can propagate and promote Islam in any way they choose. Once they gain power and become the majority, that's when Sharia comes in. Any general questions on that, why they implement it, where they're getting this information from, and why they think it's good?
Expand on the meaning, like the literal meaning, like the path to water.
Yeah. So the path to water literally comes from like the actual word like Sharia, right, which from Arabic actually should have like an H at the end of it. And it essentially means like, this is what's good for you. This is the ideal society. This is what a prosperous society that God wants you to have. So it's like a refreshment. It's a path to water. This is the path that humanity needs to follow because it's divinely inspired by Allah, and this is what's ultimately good for society. So that's why it's a path to water. It's refreshing. It's what humanity needs. Because obviously, to them, and if Allah did command this would be good. They are doing the will of Allah. If Allah is real and if he actually commanded this and et cetera, et cetera. But in their minds, this is good. This is what Allah wants. Anyone who opposes them, those are the evildoers. Those are the wrongdoers.
Do any countries actively, or governing bodies actively enact Sharia law?
Yeah, yeah. There are current countries right now that enact them. You actually have a lot of countries. I think there's like over 50 countries right now that are majority Muslim who practice Islam and will implement Sharia. Now, they do implement Sharia, interestingly enough, to differing degrees. Saudi Arabia does not, ironically, or any of the rich oil nations don't practice anything close to this. Their relations with the West are very, very strong, and they don't want to anger their biggest customers, which make them filthy rich. It's the poorer countries that actually implement Sharia on how it's described here. And it certainly, it is ridiculous. There's honor killings within families for anyone who becomes an atheist or an agnostic, which is terrible. In Christianity, if you ever denounce the faith, they're not going to kill you. You know, I would hope not. Anyway, Christians don't kill LGBTQ people, right? Islam literally tells you to throw them from high places and stone them if the fall did not kill them. That is disgusting. Religious genocide against Jews and Christians. There's a couple things right now I'm sure that you can think of specifically. They want them dead. They want us dead next. And then violence against women. A lot of Muslim countries, women can't drive, women can't get an education, women can't hold any type of position that's above a man in any sense of the word. They have to cover themselves to differing degrees. Again, there's like hijabs and burqas, and there's two other types of face covering. Some are full body, which you can't see anything. You just look like like you're just covered completely. Others, you can just see the eyes. So it depends on what degree they implement Sharia. So countries do it differently, but normally the poorer countries are the more violent ones, while the rich oil countries don't implement Sharia to this degree. And that's why there's a conversation on what Sharia actually is, who's doing quote-unquote Sharia correctly. But really, any degree of any of this is pretty appalling.
And to follow up, so if Sharia law is the way that Allah intended society to function, you would think that would play out, like it would bear fruit in terms of like a flourishing society, right? I'm curious are you aware of like how these countries that do implement that as close as possible, does that play out? Is there evidence of like, oh, this is like helping society, or this is like promoting good things in society? Not from necessarily like a Western perspective, like is the country flourishing? Like, I don't know if there's any stats on that or anything.
I am not aware of any stats, so I'm not sure. But just from like listening to it, I don't think these things lead to a prosperous society. Ironically enough, there was supposed to be a debate happening between Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy and a Muslim about which is better for society pragmatically. So putting truth aside, Christianity or Islam, no one took him up on it. Not a single Muslim debater or apologist took him up on the challenge. So it seems that would be telling, because that tells me that they don't even think it leads to a very prosperous society. Otherwise, you would be able to defend it pretty well, especially against Christianity. Any other general questions about Sharia?
Yeah, so you talked about the coverings for women. What would they say the purpose and the reason for that is?
Muhammad's wives covered up. But yes, and depending on where you are, there's different degrees of coverings. Luckily, not all Muslims are violent. About 80% of them are non-violent, which is great news. I like this statistic. I like it a lot. So about a quarter of the world is Muslim, which means that you will, in your lifetime, run into Muslims. I am almost 100% certain that will happen statistically. So this is why you're here and gaining knowledge about this particular topic. Let's say there's 8 billion people in the world. A quarter of that would be 2 billion, right? So they make up 25% of the global population. 80% of them are non-violent. So they've either been somewhat westernized, or maybe they're not majority yet, so they're not going to try to implement anything. They could still be practicing taqiyya and other things, but they're non-violent, which is good. Muslims can be great people, right? Hard workers, they give to the poor. Good charity. They pray. They're very diligent. They make awesome Christians, by the way. If you've ever talked to a Muslim convert, they are awesome. They like try to memorize the whole Bible, which is really cool. I can't do that. The problem is that around this leaves around 20% of them are violent, which is not good, and it's normally in the poorer countries. That would mean around, statistically, 400 million. That is more than the population of the entire United States. So this is not some small religious sect in the Middle East. This has bled over into almost every single nation with the sole goal of overtaking the world and spreading Islam and Sharia and monotheism. So I would say that that's problematic, and this also explains why the top 10 terrorist organizations are Islamic. Are there any questions on violent versus non-violent Muslims?
So the majority of, like, does that statistic hold within the Muslims just present within the U.S. or Western countries?
Globally. These statistics are global, right? And that would literally be worldwide. So out of 80%, like for instance, you have a lot of the violent ones in the more poorer Middle Eastern countries. That's where a lot of them are gathering.
So within the U.S., like, you wouldn't necessarily, it's like 8 out of 10 Muslims, there would probably be more nonviolent, like within the...
It could be more or less, but I would most likely say less, just statistically. Also, they're not a majority yet, so they wouldn't be violent even if they are... even if they're going to be violent later, they won't be violent now because it would hurt them. So right now, they will essentially practice taqiyya and tell you anything you want to hear until they become majority, and then once they become majority, then true colors show. Again, that's not true for all Muslims. You also just have like Sufi Muslims or very liberal Muslims or progressive Muslims that are fine, non-violent, will make a lot of metaphors and analogies for a lot of these verses. So yeah, that's normally how it goes. Any other questions before we get into their problems with Christianity?
Yes. What's the reward? So I'm assuming violence is sometimes confusing for me because I don't get the goal of it. So the goal is they are living their life and acting with Allah, what they believe Allah would have them do, violent, non-violent. What's the reward? Like, are they promised something specific, or they're just riches in paradise with Allah?
Well, the reward would be you're going to look really good to get into heaven. You're like almost a shoo-in, essentially, because you're following Allah's commands to the T. Allah says kill apostates, I'm killing an apostate, right? So, because remember, this is a works-based religion. So the more works you do and that are in line with his commands, Allah's commands, then you're going to look good. Also, if you die for Islam's sake, that is your golden ticket. If you die, like being a suicide bomber, for instance, you instantly go to paradise. That is your golden ticket. If you practice jihad and die, instant golden ticket to heaven. That is what kind of militarizes various groups and violent Muslims, because like, hey, I get to fight for my beliefs and my culture, and if I die, I get to go to heaven. That sounds like a win-win. So it really riles up young men who turn into very bitter old men that make up these numbers. So that would be the benefit.
You mentioned a little bit like some of the Sufi, like the more liberal Muslims taking a more non-literal interpretation of the Bible. I guess I'm wondering, or of the Quran. I mean, I think of sometimes like as over the years, if you've come back to different verses, right, and within the Bible there are verses that are likely not meant to be taken literally as well. Like, how much would you say that applies, like, either for genre reasons or, like, in the Bible, if there's clear, like, oh, this is meant to be poetic, this is meant to be, a historical account, or this is meant to be, something else in between. How much does that apply for the Quran?
It would apply equally. Like, if we're reading the Bible in a lens, we should read the Quran in a similar lens. Like, we would need to take it verse by verse, historical context by historical context, and make sure we're understanding the genre of the literature before we make any final determinant factors. Like, I wouldn't want to judge the Bible by one standard and the Quran by another standard. If I'm studying the Bible, I would want to know what the book's about, what the chapter before it's about, what's the chapter after it about, what that verse is about, verse above, verse below, context, who's the subject, all of that stuff, the genre that I'm reading. Same thing with the Quran. You would want to take all of that into consideration before you make a judgment on those particular verses. I think the problem is that those verses still hold today. So it's not like these Muslims are not following true Islam. I would say that these Muslims are actually the only ones that are following exactly what Allah says to the T. That is what they're doing. They're actually the more obedient ones, it seems. So yeah, but I would hold the Bible and the Quran to the same standard. All right, objections. This is my favorite part. A Muslim could come up to you. You guys know you're a Christian. They're not a Christian. They study your book. They know your book very well. They study the Bible. After all, the Injil, or the Gospel, is a part of their special revelation according to them. They use many of the same prophets, literally all of them, except Muhammad, they add. And they know where they say that it's been corrupted, quote unquote. So one of the things they'll do, I have taken their argument and I've put it in the most simple, logical, strongest form I possibly could to steelman their position. They will say something like this: you believe Jesus is God. Okay, I do. They'll ask, can God die? And you'll say no. They'll say, did Jesus die? You'll say yes. Conclusion: therefore, Jesus is not God. How would you answer? That is a very potent argument, extremely strong. That is logically consistent. The premises and conclusion look valid and sound. Is there something wrong with this, or is there nothing wrong with this? I'll let you guys sit on that for a second, because this does shake a lot of people. This is what they are taught in mosques. They have time spent on other world religions. The number one that they arm themselves against is Christianity. These are one of the things they will say. If you were in a conversation, how would you respond? I also have the answer up here, apparently.
I mean, obviously, it's hypostatic union. He's both God and man, so it's both kind of. But
that's a good start.
Yeah.
His body died, but his spirit didn't die.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
And scripture says he descended into hell. And so, God cannot die because he is the life giver, the source of all life. And so, maybe, the source of all life left his physical human body, but that doesn't mean that he ceased being the physical source of all life and died in that sense. So, what you have written there is separation of soul and body.
Yeah. Essentially, their definition of death is incorrect. They're making a different type of a metaphysical claim. So in Christianity, death does not mean the cessation of existence. It doesn't mean that you just go out of existence, because we would all agree God cannot go out of existence if he's a necessary being. But that's exactly how they're treating death in this particular logical syllogism. They're treating it as if it's cessation of existence. But in Christian views, in Christian circles, death does not mean cessation of existence. It means separation. It's a type of metaphysical separation, particularly between the soul and the body. When a soul and a body are separated, according to Christian doctrine, that is called a death. The exact opposite of a death is a resurrection, which is a conjoining of the soul and the body. There is no cessation of existence in there at all. That's why in Christianity, you don't really die, you just change locations. You will either spend eternity with God, or without God, but never will you be ceasing to exist. From the moment you're born, until forever, you will always exist in some form. Never is death considered a cessation of existence. That's more of an atheistic or agnostic metaphysic. That's not the metaphysic here, especially in regards to the hypostatic union. Can somebody explain to me the answer to the question now?
Well, I guess another way to rephrase that is if we look at the premises, can God die? Did Jesus die? It's the same three-letter word, die, like in English, but there's two different meanings. Kind of like when you go to a dictionary and you look up a word, and I don't know if I can think of one right off the top of my head, but like, I don't know, like a net could be like a fishing net, or it could be like a network, like internet. Like it's kind of like you use the same word to describe two different things. It's the same word, die, but the premise one, die, is a different definition. The premise two is the different one. So therefore, you can't actually compare them.
Yeah, you're alluding to what's called an equivocation fallacy. It's where you're using the same word in two different senses, which leads to an illogical conclusion.
That's what I meant to say, yeah.
Yes, I'll add to that, where it's like the first premise one, can God die? Yes. Exactly, like if you were in terms of solving that, or like breaking that down, because then if we're taking these different definitions and understanding it differently, and also bringing in the Trinity as well, that's exactly what happens on the cross, is that God did die momentarily, right? So the first premise then just stops there.
So in the Islamic worldview, how do they usually define die? When people die, do they cease to exist?
They define it the same way we do. Isn't that funny? Like, I literally have it in my notes. Like, that's the funny part. It says, the definition of death here is wrong. Death does not mean to cease to exist in Islam nor in Christianity. Death, meaning cessation of existence, is an atheistic claim. So, literally, they should be on board with this. This should make total sense to them. When you first saw the syllogism, I hope it kind of struck you as like, oh, that's good. It's because you may have not thought about this either in this way. But yeah, that's right. Even in Islamic theology, you will live forever in one mode or another. You will not cease to exist. So I hope that you can answer this question, because this comes up a lot. They will take one attribute of God. They will say God can or can't do this. Jesus did the opposite. Therefore, Jesus is not God. So in this regards, we just used, can God die? No. Did Jesus die? Yes. Therefore, Jesus isn't God. They'll do similar things with like omniscience. Does God know everything? Yes. Did Jesus know the hour? No. Therefore, Jesus isn't God. But they'll run to the same metaphysical problem. Anyway, are there any questions before we move on to the next objection?
Well, I just want to point out that it's kind of funny that they say this, because it's honestly like the forefathers of Christianity. This is not something that's like new to them.
That's right.
It's been answered in history.
That's right. This answer is like 2,000 years old.
Yeah.
That's right. All right. And of course, they're going to pick on like some of the most complex topics, like the hypostatic union, which just means Jesus is fully God, fully man. Next, they're going to pick on the Trinity. There we go. Objection number 2, the Trinity. Let's see. Muslims, oh man, I just have the answers right there. Muslims often object to the Trinity, claiming that it's either 3 gods or it's logically inconsistent. So for their first objection, they'll say that Christians believe in 3 gods, not 1 God. They'll say the Father is 1 God. Then you have the Son, who's another God. Then you have the Holy Spirit, which is another God. So 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 3. Even though I just said 4 right there. So they'll say, you believe in 3 gods, you are not a monotheistic religion. How do you respond?
I kind of referenced it a little bit earlier when I was talking about it, but it's the same thing with, you were saying, an equivocation.
An equivocation fallacy, yeah.
Equivocation fallacy. Like saying, like at the bottom, saying a puddle and the ocean are both water, therefore a puddle is the ocean.
We'll get into that. So for their first, there's actually 2 objections here. For the first objection, let's take this one. Your puddle analogy will be applicable to the modalism fallacy that they make in the next one. So if somebody says, hey, you have three gods, you have the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, those are three gods, what do you say to them? Because this is big. This is monotheism. If monotheism is false, that's a big problem with Christianity. You cannot be a Christian and not be a monotheist. It's a cardinal doctrine. It's a big problem. Because Islam is all about monotheism. They have a doctrine called Tawheed. It means Allah is one and has no partners or consorts. It is a very big thing. This is what Muhammad was telling all of the other people who were worshiping all those other idols. He says, no, there's only one God, and it's my God. It's my moon god. It's my black stone. That's the real one. All the other ones are fake. So how do you respond to say, nope, I only worship one, but they just counted three?
Essence versus person.
That's right. Go. You can feel free to talk to that if you want.
So there's one, as you have on the side, divine essence. There's one God, but there are three persons that all share that essence. The Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. And so by that logic, there is no contradiction. They can all equally be God and have that essence, but the math works out.
Yes, the math is mathing.
Yeah. There's a separate equation, I guess.
Earlier, they were counting, but they weren't counting gods, they were counting persons. When we say God, we are referring to the essence. If the person has the essence, then the person is God. But counting the person is not the same thing as counting the essence, also called hypostases or hypostases, but mainly people just say hypostases. It's the person-essence distinction. So we have one God, he is one essence, one substance, but that is tri-personal. So there's three expressions of the same essence. Some people call this the one what and three whos. You have one what, that's the essence, and three whos, which have the essence, the same essence. When I say God, I'm referring to the essence. And the person who has the essence would also be classified as God. But it's not a different God. It's literally the same essence. Number 2 is more fun. This is where you get the 1 + 1 + 1 = 1. They really like this one. They'll say, so if the Son has the essence of God and the Father has the essence of God, then that means the Son is the Father. So now they're agreeing with your logic, but then they're trying to find a conundrum within it. I will use your puddle analogy. And then I say, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. Because what they're saying is, well, a puddle is made of water, and the ocean is made of water, therefore a puddle is the ocean. Do you see what's wrong with that logic? Obviously, we are not saying that. Their mistake is that they are communicating what's called modalism, which is a Christian heresy, saying that there's one God who has three modes of being. In the Old Testament, he was the Father. Then he became the Son in the New Testament, and now he's the Spirit. I said, no, I don't believe that either, because then you run into this problem. If you just count the essence and not the persons, you solve this problem as well. Oh yeah, there's the analogy right there. So yeah, again, it's the essence-person distinction. I'll just read from my notes. It says, the essence is God, and the persons are the individuals. The person doesn't make something God. I'm a person, and you're a person, but we are not God. God isn't God because of the person. He's God because of the essence. It's the essence that makes a person God. God's essence is tripersonal. Or when I say Jesus is God, the God refers to the essence, and the person refers to Jesus, not the other way around. Also, I go on and say that even by an Islamic standard or a Quranic standard, that Jesus is God even according to them. Because in the Quran, in Surah 57, verse 3, Allah says that He is the first and the last. In the Quran, no one else has that title. Well, Jesus literally calls himself the first and the last in the New Testament in Revelation 22, verse 13. He literally says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Jesus just gave himself a title that only Allah has. That would mean, even by a Quranic standard, that Jesus is Allah. I know this one is more complicated than the other ones. The last one is not as complicated, but before I move on from the Trinity, which is a very fun topic, does anyone have any thoughts on it, or do they understand the person-essence distinction, which will prevent you from entering any problem with the Trinity? It's logically coherent. If you have the one what, which is the essence, and three whos. All right, last slide. Objection 3. They'll say that your Bible and your gospel have been corrupted, and that's why Allah had to send the Quran and correct everything. Because we all know the Bible has been changed countless times and has been translated. It's a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation. People have been copying this for generations. Mistakes have been made, and it's like the telephone game, right? Somebody tells somebody tells someone else, somebody tells somebody else, somebody tells somebody else, and then the end word, the end of the word, is not the same word that you started with. So how would you respond?
I'm just say the translation part is wrong.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Well, the telephone game, that would be true if it was a translation of translations, like serial translations, right? Where, you run something 100 times through Google Translate, the original phrase, it comes out the other end completely gibberish sometimes. So I get that. But in the case of the Bible, it was we have translations of the original manuscript, right? So it's the original manuscript, and then that spread out several translations, right? So it was working with the original source and then translating that out, which would then be kind of the first mode of communication, and then also the written tradition, like Jewish tradition, for copying manuscripts was very revered, right? Not the same, I guess, culturally today. We're writing, we kind of just write stuff haphazardly, and like if there are mistakes, like whatever, like it was written or taken very seriously. So the idea of like there being errors or it being like seriously different from the original manuscripts is wrong, and also we can see that from later manuscripts which is earlier and how they match up very closely. So this is where I would start.
Yeah, I would say original manuscript. I would say like a core manuscript. So I agree with you on that, and you're right. It's not like it's being translated from Koine Greek to Latin or Syriac to Latin to German to English. We get our English translation straight from the Greek. So it doesn't go through all these translations like people try to frame it. We actually just get it from the original language. But we don't even need to do that. Why? Because the Quran says I should judge by my book, and my book can't be corrupted or isn't corrupted. There are verses in the Quran that tell Christians to judge what Allah has revealed therein to me, meaning the gospel or the Injil. According to the Quran, Allah's words can't be corrupted. Allah's revelations can't be corrupted. The Injil and the gospel, according to the Quran, are Allah's revelation. Therefore, if my book was corrupted, then Islam is false, because you're telling me to judge by a corrupted book. Your God is telling me to judge by a corrupted book. If it's not corrupted, then Islam is still false. Why? Because my book contradicts your book, and your book says there should be no contradictions. So whether my book is corrupted or uncorrupted, Islam is false. So I don't need to become defensive as a Christian and say that, oh no, I can tell you why we have the best manuscripts very early on, full Bibles by the 4th century, coming from even earlier fragments that date to the 2nd century, and are extremely reliable to where we have thousands and thousands of these, much more than the Quran. I don't need to do any of that. Even though I do address it in my fourth worldview session. Instead, I simply point back to their book. Your Quran says my book isn't corrupted. Your book says my book can't be corrupted. So if it is corrupted, then your book is wrong. If it's not corrupted, your book is still wrong. Conclusion, Islam is false. This is my favorite one, 547. It's essentially saying to Christians that you can't judge anyone. Like, you stand on naught unless you judge by the gospel. It's talking to Christians. I'm judging by the gospel. Gospel says Jesus died. Quran says Jesus doesn't die. Quran seems to be false. Why? My book's closer to the event it records. Your book is after. Your book has internal contradictions and it says it doesn't. That's a problem. So either way, Islam is false. So if the Bible was corrupted pre-Muhammad, then Allah commanded following a flawed book, implying Allah is imperfect. 2, if the Bible was corrupted post-Muhammad, then Allah failed to preserve his revelation, which contradicts the Quran, which says Allah's words cannot be corrupted. If the Bible was never corrupted, then its teachings, such as Jesus being God, Jesus dying by crucifixion, and being resurrected, are true, thus disproving the Quran. It does not matter which of the prongs of this dilemma they pick, the Quran is false in every single one of them. This is called the Quranic dilemma. There are loads of verses that say this. The Quran verifies, not corrects, the Quran verifies the gospel and the Torah. There's even verses that say, if you're in doubt about the Quran, then talk to the people of wisdom, talk to the people of the book. Well, the people of the book are the Jews and the Christians. It's telling Muslims to talk to me, and I'll tell them if their book's right. I'm telling them their book is false. Whether my book is true or if my book is false, Islam fails. Does that make sense? It's called the Quranic dilemma. And if anyone has any free time, I would highly recommend looking up a video by David Wood on this. It is very, very well done. Any questions before we close?
Yeah, I have a quick one. So as far as how Christians and Jews are viewed from the perspective of Islam, obviously with Christians there's like two layers of us with the New Testament and the Old Testament, but is there do they place more critical beliefs towards Christians or Jews, depending on how much doctrines or books that we have? Is there a difference from them?
Are you, let me make sure I understand the question. Are you saying which group do Muslims view as more authoritative?
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
I don't know. We might be equal because Muhammad tells Muslims at first, at least, he'll say, talk to the Jews and Christians. I was prophesied in their book. I was prophesied in the Torah. I was prophesied in the gospel or the Injil. So go talk to them and they'll tell you about me because I was prophesied. The Quran was coming. I was coming, right? Then they go and talk to the Jews, and the Jews are like, we don't know who this guy is, right? And then Muhammad, he scribbles them out. He goes, nope, kill the Jews. Jews are bad. Go talk to the Christians. I'm prophesied in their book. Same thing happened. They go, talk to the Christians. Christian goes, we don't have this guy in our book. He goes, kill the Jews and the Christians. That's how you get chapter 9. But if anyone ever does say that Muhammad is in the Bible, I agree with that. I do think Muhammad is in the Bible. He is in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. That says that many false prophets will arise among you and will do even miracles, right? And he'll lead you astray. And that's exactly where he is. So as soon as somebody comes to me and they say that, I say, I agree with you. You are right. He is in there. Let me show you. Anyway, so does anyone else have any final thoughts or questions about Islam? And this is just Sunni Islam. There are variations within schools of thought. But this summary will be a good general view of core doctrines across most of them. Some don't have 6 pillars, some have 4 or 5. Some don't have all the articles. They have less or more.
So would Islam say God doesn't have a physical form?
It would depend what Muslim you ask or what school of thought. So some Muslims will say Allah does have a physical form. He has so many eyes or hands or feet. And then others will say, no, that's metaphorical. And then they'll kill each other. Over that difference. They take it so seriously, which I understand. Like, I respect their seriousness, right? So when you're talking about God, that's respectable. But I wouldn't do that. Especially if you guys believe the same thing almost, except one just believes that it's physical and one believes that it's not.
Okay, what is the black stone then?
Like, they just think like the black stone is just something that will testify for you on the last day if you kissed it. And they don't even equate it with Allah. It could just be like an intercessor of sorts.
What do they do with sin? How do they atone for that?
You just do good works.
And it'll cancel it out?
Yeah.
Like a 1v1 situation?
Well, yeah, it depends on, Allah will be the judge. So I don't know how Allah does that. Like, I don't know, like, if you kill somebody, do you need to like revive somebody? And like those cancel out? Like, I don't know how he does that. What's it called? They don't have any assurance of salvation unless you die in a jihad. Unless you die for or performing jihad, you could be like the best Muslim ever, and if you sin once, then Allah could send you to hell. So it's really up to Allah and how He judges you. So there is the only assurance in Islam, to my knowledge, is dying in jihad, is dying like for the cause, right, or being martyred, more specifically. Then that is your golden ticket to heaven. But everywhere else, it's just up to Allah, and it's works-based. So Allah will look at your works. Some even believe that angels follow you around, and they record your good deeds and your bad deeds, which I talk a little bit about that in session 3. But yeah, it's a scary time. Yeah, you're literally just winging it. Yeah, that's right. Which is why I'm thinking that the Muslims that are very zealous are the ones that are violent, and because they want their golden ticket. Like, it makes sense. It makes sense why they are the way they are. So, yep, that is an introduction to Sunni Islam.